This is 3Q. Well, Australia is only one of many countries that has an ageing population, but our superannuation scheme is unique. Over the first 15 years, it built up enormous capital, but given the uncertain international markets, today we ask on 3Q, is superannuation at a crossroads? Gerard Noonan is the Deputy President of the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees. Gerard, just give us a bit of a potted history. How and why did Australia get this system?
Well, a long time ago, back in the never, by which I mean about 30 years ago, there were only really a small group of people who had any sort of savings for their retirement. They tended to be upper management people and people in the public sector. So basically the bulk of the workforce had nothing at all. And actually the unions got involved in this, thought that this was a really good campaign to get underway. They got agreement eventually with employers to put together this scheme. And so the government eventually decided, well, okay, if that's the way we want to go, why don't we start putting aside monies from salary increases into this thing called superannuation? And that's really where it began. It started at 3%. It's now at 9% of everybody's salary. And it's soon to go to 12% or over a period of the next 7 or 8 years. So, I mean, in potted terms, it was an awareness that there was nothing available for most people in the workforce, and yet people knew that down the track they'd be reliant entirely on a pension for most people. So that it was a decision to kind of modernise Australia's pension system.
And inoculate ourselves for an ageing population. So we have $1.4 trillion now in superannuation. Right. How does this compare to other countries? Is there anyone else in the world that has the same system?
Well, look, Australia bats about 15th or 16th in the total world economies, but the $1.4 trillion, soon to go to 2 trillion and then 3 trillion. I mean, who would have ever thought we'd be using words like trillion, but here we are. So by the middle of the 2020s, it'll be $3 trillion of monies. Australia at 15th, it actually bats about 3rd now in terms of the amount of money that sits there in the superannuation system. So it's a real outlier. It's a very positive outlier in world terms.
And it means in a way we're all shareholders now and much more engaged with the economic system. I wonder, given this sort of feeling of insecurity despite our economy being good, is a part of that though? Does it make us more worried about the international markets given that we have super in them?
Well, we've got super in international markets, in the national markets, but we have superannuation in things like infrastructure, in bonds, and and a range of things in property. So most of the superannuation funds actually invest across a wide range of assets, as we call them, to ensure that the returns are balanced and that we don't sort of get hit by a big share market crash and lose everything. So it's that sort of idea, but it's also there to build Australia. So yes, our monies are being used out there in the kind of the public markets to do things, our superannuation monies, but is that such a bad thing? Well, my view would be, no, it's not. It's actually a good thing.
So you feel we are at a crossroads, given that what's happened with the international market?
Look, I think that one thing that's really affecting people is that the decade of the noughties, as we call them, from 2000 through to 2010 or 11, right, has been a terrible time for markets. Basically, a terrible time for the system, the economic systems that we're all running, comparable pretty much to the 1930s as far as the impact is concerned. But the 2 decades before that were not like that at all. And so if you assume that everything's going to be like the noughties forever and ever and ever, well then you throw your hands in the air and give up. But I'm not of that view. I think that over time things will stabilise down and you'll end up with kind of an average, and that would be an average return in the order of 8% a year for most people's superannuation investments.
You mentioned infrastructure, and in New South Wales State, the New South Wales State Super's agreed to consider investing in more infrastructure. Is that way to go in Australian infrastructure now, so there's a benefit to society and our economy, especially given the world circumstances?
Well, most of the funds that we, in the not-for-profit sector, and you've got Paul here from Australian Super, they do the same thing as I do in Media Super, which is another smaller fund. We have about 10% of our total assets sitting in infrastructure anyway. So it's not as though we're unused to that. And we do think it's a really, really good thing to do, to invest in our own country and in sort of productive ports and airports and railways and things of that sort that actually the infrastructure investment goes into. So it's it's a solid underpinning to an economy as well as being preparation for people's retirement.
Paul, should you be doing more of it?
Oh, I think the thing that Gerard deals with is really important, that this is primarily about building people's retirement outcomes and their retirement incomes, and it's great for the economy, it's great for the government, it's actually one of those perfectly virtuous things if you get it right. Part of that is infrastructure, and one of the beauties of a super fund is it's got a long-term horizon, and the infrastructure's got the advantage of earning a bit like equities with less of the volatility. So it's a good thing actually for the recipients and the members in the fund, and it has the other advantage of investing in things that need to be built.
What's your view, Matt? Should it be a focus on building infrastructure or just focusing on what gets the best return for members?
Oh, look, I think in the first instance, in the case of members, I think funds which invest in infrastructure is quite important from the perspective that, as Paul mentioned, they perform differently to equities, so they're not as volatile over time. And typically when they're invested in good quality assets which are generating strong long-term cash flows, there's a good outcome for members in terms of returns. And certainly in recent times, it's one of the reasons I think why people shouldn't necessarily just look at what the stock market's doing each day in terms of what that means for their super. For super funds that invest more in infrastructure, people can have confidence that there's strong long-term cash returns coming in respect to those assets, and they're real assets out in the economy. So yes, it is a good thing. But you know, with any prudent investment strategy, it's important to have a range of different different places where money's invested. So it's certainly part of the equation and an important one so far as industry funds are concerned.
It's interesting that, as Matt says, in the funds that I'm involved with, we get about somewhere between 8 and 11% return each year from our infrastructure investment. Now that actually is the long-term returns that we'd be hoping to get over 20, 30, 40 years. So it's a pretty good investment actually for our members, as well as having that other virtuous outcome of building things for the country.
You get a feel-good factor, you know, this train line brought to you by, you feel like you're actually building your own train line with your own assets.
Well, people can understand it, actually. So if you talk to someone and say, we own that railway station, or we own that part of that airport, or we're building this pipeline, people understand that. But as Matt said, that you have to have a balanced portfolio of a range of risk-weighted assets, and I think infrastructure forms an important part of our investment strategy and has proven to be valuable.
Now, another big change that may be coming up is a possible change of government in the next year. Gerard, what would that mean? Has the Coalition given many hints about what it would do to the superannuation system we have?
Okay, change the politics. Look, I'm of the view that it's not necessarily going to be the case that there'll be a change of government, but I'm probably in a minority there, but nevertheless, there's still a year to go before there's an election, and lots can happen in a year. But let's assume that that does occur. Yes, there are hints from the opposition about what it wants to do. A couple of things. The opposition has a view about the way superannuation funds are run. They've got an antagonism, generally speaking, to unions being involved in superannuation fund governance, and to some lesser degree to employer organisations doing that. And that's the model that we've had going very successfully for 25 years. And so they've indicated that they're not happy about that. They're wanting, kind of changes there.
What is the point of having the unions on the funds? What is that? Are they representing workers' interests in terms of investments and the like?
Indeed, they're representing the members of the funds. Across a wide range of industry funds and government funds, there are representatives of employees, typically unions, and they're usually very highly skilled people operating as trustees on these funds, and there are representatives of the employers on these funds, and that's the basic model that we've used successfully for the past 25 years, the equal representation model as it's called. And that's produced really good outcomes. I mean, ones that if you go around the world, people say to me when I'm at conferences and so on, wow, how did you do that? And the answer is, well, it was a good idea at the time, and it's still a good idea. However, the opposition has taken a view, it doesn't like that, and it wants to see some change there. The other thing that the opposition has indicated is that it doesn't like compulsion. And so where superannuation at the moment, Matt mentioned earlier, it's at 9%, and going to 12. The opposition has a view that should be more voluntarist. In other words, people should volunteer to put money in rather than be obliged to put money in.
What would that mean if we're not forced to do it?
Well, I think the viewers can actually work out what happens when you're not forced to do anything, particularly when it comes to putting money aside for something that's 40 years away. It's a pretty big ask to expect people to do that. And you look around the world at countries that have had a voluntary model, and Australia is like a shining beacon around the world because we've had this model that's a different one and it's actually standing out.
And I think the thing is to make sure that balance is right. Actually, people do need to be forced to do what's good for them as a general rule. It's really hard to get people to save. The reason we've got savings is because people have been forced to save. But of course, people can also add their own money in. And of course, also people are building assets outside. They're either investing in their home if they can afford to, they're saving other things as well. So I think what Gerard's talking about mostly here is the balance. The thing that served Australia well and got to 1.4 trillion is the 9%. The 9 to 12 looks like the coalition's supportive of that as well. So the core thing is going to be in place. The debate in the future is what is that balance into the future.
And what do you think the other next great challenge is for superannuation, Gerard?
Well, I think we've got to now bed down what's a really good system, and that sounds like that's going to be an easy thing to do, but it's a very, very big. It basically covers all people in Australia, so it requires proper governance, and we do think that it's actually really well governed at the moment. You might vary a few things there, but so that would be the one. Locking in that move to 12% is a really important part of it. Paul's right. The formal position of the opposition has been, yes, look, reluctantly, we won't unravel it, is what they've really said. But in the rhetoric that, in talking with representatives of the opposition, they are much more of the voluntarist model, so that if they could have had it that way, they'd prefer it. So bedding down that 12% is a really important thing to really put the final nail in this great edifice that we've put together is would be a really important thing.
All right, well, if you would like to make some comments, you can post them on essentialvision.com.au or follow the 3Q hashtag on Twitter. This is 3Q.